Vincent Carroll here. This is tutorial number 9. Damp. Damp has a very bad press within acupuncture. It's viewed as difficult to get rid of. It's viewed as having a tendency to reoccur. Words like sticky are often used in describing damp. Damp, from a Western medical point of view, the correspondence, I believe, will be extracellular fluid. In acupuncture, it is believed that a certain baseline of energy is needed to retain fluid within the cells. That's called intracellular fluid. Fluid within the cells, of course, gives the body structure by giving the cells structure. But if that baseline energy, meaning spleen chi energy, is deficient, there's a tendency for that intracellular fluid to leave the cells and become extracellular. Or in the language of acupuncture, using acupuncture English, we would use the word damp. So once damp is free from the cells, it does what all fluid does. It finds a fluid level. So it drizzles down to the ankles and to the fingers. And various manifestations therefore can occur, such as rings and jewellery can be trapped on fingers. Sock marks can become very prominent as well. And that's a very useful sign to look out for. And indeed to ask the patient, do you have sock marks? Because it's something they often recognise, as opposed to their feet expanding, not fitting shoes. Sock marks, I think, are a more reliable question to ask the person. But a heaviness in the legs is what it really manifests as, because of course that's mainly towards evening time, simply because by the time the fluid drizzles down it takes a number of hours for that to happen, so it's more likely to be there in the evening. Of course, persistent damp is there all of the time. But when damp drizzles down, it might be obstructed by the knees. It can be difficult for damp to navigate past the knees because it represents a choke point in the leg. So very often a person might have only, with a lot of damp, might only have mild manifestations in the lower leg and the ankles, and they might have quite an amount of expansion and heaviness above the knees. Everybody's different. But when damp is in the body, damp manifests in a number of different ways. Of course, it reinvades the spleen. Let's talk about that in a moment. What it does also is it produces what is described as cock-crow diarrhea. Now, what on earth do we mean by that? We mean a heavily moisturized stool, to such an extent because the spleen is not transforming fluid, so therefore fluid is accumulating, and just as it accumulates in the lower legs, it also accumulates in the rectum, and in doing so a heavily moisturized stool with a difficulty being retained by the anal sphincter. So there's a tendency for that stool to be passed early in the morning, hence the word cock-crow diarrhea. Now also, one speaks about teeth marks on the tongue. What exactly does that mean? Well, of course, the tongue expands because of moisture, and the teeth crunch down on the tongue because the tongue becomes, in effect, too big to fit comfortably into one's mouth. So naturally, one has teeth marks. So teeth marks are another sign of extracellular fluid. It's also mentioned that damp reinvades the spleen. How can we explain that in simple terms? Well, when damp comes outside of the cells, in other words, extracellular fluid has the perception of weight. But once fluid is inside the cells, you don't have the perception of weight. You don't have the perception of heaviness. Heaviness and weight are something that we recognize when fluid leaves the cells. So in other words, when you have damp or extracellular fluid. And naturally, if you carry 2 suitcases around, you're going to tire out earlier than if you don't. This is probably a simplistic way of looking at it, but it's an accurate way because, of course, damp now is outside of the cells. It is drizzling down to the lowest sumps of the body, the fingers and especially the feet, and pulling yourself around requires that extra bit of energy, using up the spleen chi. So therefore, when damp reinvades the spleen, we mean that the heaviness associated with the extracellular fluid, or the damp, puts an extra strain on your root of post-heaven chi, which is spleen chi. In other words, you're working harder, you're doing more, and therefore you're spending more spleen chi energy. So damp has a range of, I suppose, negative impacts in the body, and these negative impacts include the cock-crow diarrhea, include the spleen, the damp reinvading the spleen, include the cock-crow diarrhea, diarrhea and other and the tongue being expanded and other things associated, I suppose, with damp. Damp is quite difficult to get rid of. I needle spleen 9 bilaterally, and of course heat can go into the damp as well, and of course if that happens you have to take heat out. And the classic examples of heat in the damp are sweaty, scratchy, itchy legs in bed at night where a person tears away at themselves, because of course heat rises, but if it's trapped in the damp it doesn't rise, and it is trapped in the legs, creating these sweaty, scratchy legs at night. It can be extremely distressing. And of course heat in the damp can get very hot indeed. We don't use the word fire in the damp, presumably because a bucket of water can't catch fire, but certainly the damp can become so hot that creates a really intense heat in the damp, causing a lot of scratching, including the drawing of blood. So these are things we need to be aware of with damp as we understand the use of that word damp. And it's important to understand precisely what we mean so that we can understand the various manifestations of damp. Damp, of course, can also occupy the lower pelvic area, because again, that's another cul-de-sac, if you like, that's another sump. And again, when once there, it's an area that can easily get heat invaded into, creating what from a Western medical point of view we could describe as various infections like cystitis, for example. When damp, of course, occurs and damp drizzles down, say to the ankles or the feet, again, if there's any external manifestation, if the person kneels on a rusty nail, for example, you'll get a cellulitis. And a cellulitis, from a Western medical point of view, I believe corresponds to damp heat from an acupuncture medical point of view. And of course, you have to take heat out, but heat can come internally as well, mental, emotionally, very often from the liver. And that can fuel and cause damp to catch heat. So heat in the damp can come about that way. But the treatment, as I mentioned, is bilateral spleen 9. Now, of course, you also have to tonify the root of post heaven chi, probably again and again. I mean, several sessions there to tonify the root of post heaven chi to keep damp and drive damp away with spleen 9 bilaterally. And of course, always take heat out of the damp if you suspect heat is in the damp. If a person has cold damp, personally, I'm not inclined to apply heat for a very simple reason. It's a very thin line between cold damp and letting heat enter into the damp, so the application of moxa carries a certain element of risk. Those are my only personal observations about that. So in treatment, spleen 9 bilaterally and tonify the root of post heaven chi. I would tonify with spleen 3 as well as source point of the spleen to tonify. Thank you.